"Alex, can you wrap this up for me?" My wife, Emma, comes running from the kitchen, carrying 3 lunchboxes. The lunchboxes she's holding are pink, white, and black. The black one has a large name label with both Alex and my names printed on it. I got laughed at for having a label that looks like it's for a grade schooler. Well, you're the one who said you wanted to be able to tell which one was yours at a glance when handing them out. Different colors would have been enough. Besides, the labels won't be visible once they're in the lunch bags, right? As I counted, Emma puffed out her cheeks and said, "Bet is safe than sorry," before turning on her heel and heading back to the kitchen. I didn't quite agree, but as long as Emma is enjoying herself, that's all that matters. I finish tying my tie and pick up the 3 lunch bags that are already prepared on the dining table. I place the lunches Emma made into each bag. I put a frozen jelly on top of each lunchbox to act as a cold pack. My business bag, which I bought 6 months ago to fit the 3 lunch bags, is as big as a hiking backpack. Carrying this load every morning gives me a sense of purpose. Well, I'm off. As I raised my hand and headed towards the front door, I heard Emma's drawn-out voice saying, "Take care, have a good day." It's been 10 years since Emma and I got married. We're no longer in the kind of relationship where I'd expect her to see me off at the door. Still, sometimes I feel a bit lonely with these brief exchanges. I take the elevator down and step out into the condo entrance. There, I hear the familiar voice calling, "Alex, it's gonna be hot today, so make sure to drink plenty of water." Looking up towards the voice, I see Emma waving her hand energetically. Smiling from the balcony, she still has the same innocence as when we first met. The sunlight reflecting off something on her arm caught my eye. It was Emma's arm. The artificial sheen of Emma's prosthetic arm, unlike human skin, couldn't fully absorb the sunlight. "I'm off," I called back loudly. Emma's smile grew even wider. Since I first met her, Emma has had a prosthetic right arm. I met Emma during the summer of my junior year in college. I was studying caregiving and social welfare and spent my summer vacation volunteering. It was at an inclusive sports team, part of my volunteer work, that I met Emma. Back then, Emma was a high school student, with cropped hair and no makeup, giving her an overall boyish appearance. If someone had introduced her as a boy in the upper grades of elementary school, I might have believed it. When we first greeted each other, Emma wore the same blooming smile she showed from the balcony. And with that same elongated voice, she asked, "Do you like basketball, mister?" Looking back, it was probably love at first sight. I continued visiting that team almost every day until the end of the summer break, growing close enough with Emma to call each other by our first names. However, as I started my job search and Emma began planning her future, we lost touch. I was offered a position at a company that makes assistive devices just before graduation. When I visited the sports team again to say hello after a long time, I found Emma had become a coach instead of a player. I thought about what I wanted to do in the future, and the first thing that came to mind was children's faces. After exploring various options like becoming a daycare worker or a school teacher, Emma passed me a basketball and said, and I realized one more thing I love. She wanted to support kids who, like her, wished to play sports despite their circumstances. Emma came to that realization and volunteered to coach the team. After we got married, she also joined an adult team, and she was thrilled to be able to focus on basketball more than ever. By the time I graduated from college, Emma already working, and I naturally became a couple, until I became accustomed to the harsh realities of society. Emma always stood by my side with that unwavering smile. If I hadn't had a prosthetic arm, I would have continued playing basketball even with one hand. That's how much I love basketball. I've always had this ball with me since I was a kid. I wanted to protect Emma's happy smile as she hugged a basketball to her chest. And I want to teach kids that just because you lose something, it doesn't mean you have to give up. I want to show them that, Emma said, looking towards the future. I felt lucky to have her by my side. My parents were happy about my marriage to Emma. Surprisingly, it was Emma's parents who opposed it. They were likely worried about the burden on me. When I told my friends about the marriage, the looks directed at Emma's arm were not negative. The one most concerned about her situation was Emma herself. One night, as the wedding approached, Emma asked, "Are you really okay with this?" She must have always carried that anxiety, Swallowing her fears and worries, she stood firm on trembling legs and smiled. I wanted to protect such a brave Emma. Even now, I still feel that way. That day, I hugged Emma's trembling shoulders and said, "You don't have to do it all alone anymore." Emma, crying, nodded and said thank you over and over. 10 years later, I can now even take care of Emma's prosthetic arm. I've even learned how to position myself on the pack train to avoid crushing the bag with 3 lunches inside. Stepping onto the crowded platform, I let out a deep breath. Once again, I managed to protect the lunches Emma made for me. Just that makes me feel like today will end happily. That's how much I love Emma. The morning hustle in New York's business district is overwhelming. The building where the assistive device company I work for is located is no exception, teeming with people hurrying somewhere. Even after getting off the packed train, there's no sense of relief in a city like New York. I swung my backpack around to the front and hugged it protectively. That's when I heard it. "Good morning, Alex." A deep, gravelly voice, not quite what you'd expect to hear in the morning, reached my ears. Turning around, I saw Mr. Smith, the executive vice president, waving at me. With his gray hair stylishly swept back, Mr. Smith looked like a gentleman straight out of a classic film. I've always thought he'd look perfect in a Sherlock Holmes costume. He would definitely pull it off. "What's the matter? You look like a sheep being chased by a wolf." He chuckled as he walked up beside me. "Is the treasure in your backpack?" He teased with a playful smile. "Just kidding. 3 lunchboxes are quite a load. Thanks for always going the extra mile." When Mr. Smith expresses gratitude or apologies, he always makes sure to look the person in the eye. Even if we're walking through a crowd, he stops to make sure his words are fully conveyed. Every time I feel his sincerity, I remember 6 months ago when he nodded his head to me. "How's your wife doing? Doesn't the area where a prosthetic meets her skin hurt more as summer approaches?" She used to mention it when we first met, but she hasn't said anything about it lately. She sent me off cheerfully this morning, too. At first, people were surprised to see an ordinary sales employee walking alongside Mr. Smith, but now, our casual conversations have become a familiar sight. We reached the sales floor without anyone giving us a curious glance. "Well, see you tonight." I swung my backpack around to the front. Just as I was about to take out the lunches, Mr. Smith grabbed my arm. "Sorry to add to your load, but I'll be out on calls until the afternoon. Could you store these in the sales department's fridge? I don't have one in my office," he said with an apologetic look. Though he was smiling, his gray eyebrows were furrowed in concern. "It's unusual for you to be out on calls, but it's no problem for me. The fridge in the break room is large, so space isn't an issue," I replied, putting him at ease. Our cooperation, which started 6 months ago, wouldn't be strained by something like this. Half a year ago, Mr. Smith had called me to a consultation room on another floor. As the name suggests, the room was used for internal consultations about business matters. Respecting confidentiality, the walls were made of smoked glass, making it impossible to see who was inside from the outside. It was then that I learned Mr. Smith's only daughter, Isabella Taylor, had a prosthetic leg. Isabella had been playing basketball since before she started elementary school and happened to be on the team Emma coached. Hearing from someone that Emma was my wife, Mr. Smith had nodded deeply to me and asked, "Even if it's just on practice days, could you prepare nutritious and strengthening dinners for her? Of course, I wouldn't expect you to do it for free. I'll cover the cost of ingredients and pay you for your time," he added, looking somewhat weary. Everyone at the company knew he was a single father. It was also well known that he managed everything on his own without hiring helpers or sitters. He reached out to me because Isabella had started seriously aiming to become a professional player, and he realized she needed a proper nutritional plan for that. Isabella often talks about how amazing the lunches coach brings are. Even when I try to replicate the menu from what she describes, it takes me too long to make, he said, scratching his nose sheepishly. His love for Isabella was evident. It was clear how much Isabella meant to him. He suddenly had a pained expression. He must have wanted to handle everything himself. Some people find it hard to ask for help, and it must have been a tough decision for him. Naturally, I agreed. I also told him I didn't need any money for ingredients or labor, but in exchange, I wanted him to get some proper rest. Today is a team practice day, so Emma packed an extra special lunch for me to bring. It was Emma who suggested making lunch for both Isabella and Mr. Smith. Sorry for the extra load. I'll come by the sales department as soon as I'm done with my rounds. What's your schedule like today, Anderson? It's no problem at all, I replied. Today, I have a meeting with a new client in the morning and a product presentation in the afternoon. That's an efficient approach. But remember, some clients value face-to-face interactions. Make sure to distinguish who they are, Mr. Smith advised, placing a hand on my shoulder in a fatherly manner. At that moment, a loud greeting echoed from behind. "Good morning, Mr. Smith." "Good morning, Parker." Since the voice came from behind me, Mr. Smith must have known exactly who it was. Hearing the voice and the name, my body reacted instinctively. Before I knew it, I had turned around. Standing there was Parker, the sales department manager. Parker shook hands with Mr. Smith, smiling, but then directed a cold gaze at me. It was just a brief moment, but his sharp eyes made me catch my breath. Parker is obsessed with getting promoted. It's not hidden ambition. Everyone can see it, and he frequently says, "I want to move up." There aren't many executive positions available. To Parker, my camaraderie with Mr. Smith must be quite irksome. His attitude toward me had clearly changed since 6 months ago. It's not uncommon for Parker to appear when Mr. Smith and I are talking. Despite being aware of this, Mr. Smith's calm demeanor always catches me off guard, and I end up surprised every time. "Mr. Smith, you shouldn't just be friendly with Alex. How about we chat some time? I found a great Japanese restaurant. How about it?" "Sorry, I want to spend time with my daughter. Once Isabella becomes more independent, I'd love to check it out." Mr. Smith declined Parker's invitation and raised a hand in a polite gesture as he left the sales department. As soon as Mr. Smith's bag disappeared down the hallway, Parker moved away from me as well. His parting words, "Don't get too comfortable," were spoken in a surprisingly low tone. "Today's lunch is Chinese," Mr. Smith informed me as promised, visiting me first thing in the afternoon. Before coming to the sales department, he had sent a message to confirm that it was a good time, so I arranged to meet him in the break room. Parker was scheduled to stay in the office all day, so it was better to avoid any more awkward encounters. Chinese food, huh? I'm looking forward to it. I had some at lunch, and it was really delicious. You're in for a treat. Mr. Smith gently stroked the lunchbox and murmured, "I'm always grateful." "Not at all. Thanks to your request, the meals on practice days are more elaborate, and I get to enjoy them too. I'm the one who should be thanking you." Mr. Smith gave a slightly troubled smile and remarked, "It's a waste to keep you as just a regular employee." I felt a cold shiver run down my spine. The sharp gaze of Parker flashed in my mind. "Well, see you tonight." As Mr. Smith was about to leave the break room, I instinctively grabbed his arm. He looked at me, puzzled. "Whether or not you're that kind of person," I began, swallowing hard to ease my dry throat. "I just want to say that the reason I'm giving you these lunches is because I understand what it's like to have a similar family situation. I hope you can separate this from our work. I apologize if I'm speaking out of turn." I nodded deeply. Seeing Parker's sharp gaze confused me, and I started to doubt what kind of person Mr. Smith really was. Mr. Smith, with an even gentler smile than usual, raised the lunchbox beside his face. "I understand," he said. "This won't affect your evaluation. Work is work. I was just admiring your way of speaking that doesn't make the other person feel guilty." With a quick glance at his watch, he added, "Well, see you later," and left the break room. I felt the tension drain from my body. My palms were unexpectedly damp with sweat. "Nervous," I muttered as I took a deep breath and prepared to leave the break room. As I opened the door, I instinctively stepped back. Standing in front of the break room was Parker. "So that's how you're buttering him up." "Ingratiate myself? What do you mean by that?" Parker's eyebrows were raised in anger. I took a step forward, closing the distance I had retreated. "Your wife has a prosthetic arm, and Mr. Smith's daughter has a prosthetic leg. So, you're using that to get close to him, pretending to be comrades. Those lunches your wife makes, you're just using them to show off how much effort she puts in despite her prosthetic, right? You're overthinking it." It's not about using that to get close to Mr. Smith or anything like that. And saying bad things about those lunches is uncalled for. I would never use my family to get ahead in my career. Parker's wife has been hospitalized for a long time. When I joined the company, he was already balancing his job with taking care of his children and his wife's needs. I don't neglect my home because of work, and I don't give up on promotions because of my home situation. Parker once told me while training me, his smile bright and supportive, not the cold look he now directed at me. So if you ever feel like giving up, Alex, come to me. I'll give you a good pep talk, he had said, putting an arm around my shoulder. Back then, Parker's children, who are now in middle school, were very young when his wife was first hospitalized. He had managed to support his family alone, taking care of his kids and his wife without letting it affect his work. The hardships Parker has faced are unimaginable. Despite everything, he managed to keep his personal struggles from impacting his professional life and the people around him. He had risen to the position of sales department manager. If he had been in an environment where he could focus entirely on his work, his name would likely be on the executive roster by now. I might have been the one to disrupt Parker's mental balance. No, it's more likely that the collaboration between me and Mr. Smith did. Since I started giving lunches to Isabella and Mr. Smith, a deep rift had formed between Parker and me. That's not my intention at all. Please, let me explain. I've heard enough. I don't want to listen to the excuses of someone I once mentored. My outstretched hand grasped nothing but air. Without listening to my side of the story, Parker headed towards the sales department floor. I watched as his back disappeared into the sales department, feeling the weight of the growing distance between us. I stood there in a daze, unable to do anything but watch. Mr. Smith had started going on more business calls. It seemed that Isabella's medical appointments had decreased, allowing him to prioritize work more. 2 weeks had passed since the rift with Parker deepened. He only spoke to me when absolutely necessary. Before things could get any worse, I made a proposal to Mr. Smith to handle the lunch exchange in the break room. This arrangement seemed convenient for Mr. Smith, given his increased business calls. He readily agreed to my suggestion. Today was another practice day for the basketball team, and Mr. Smith mentioned he would be out on business calls until the afternoon again. The lunches for Isabella and Mr. Smith were resting in the refrigerator of the sales department's break room as usual. This morning, Mr. Smith glanced at my backpack and remarked, "Looks like today's lunch is even more extravagant, huh?" As the executive had said, today's lunchbox was luxurious. In fact, impressive might be an understatement. Today was the day when the starting members for the first match of next month's tournament were to be announced. Emma had been poring over the player list for weeks, making agonized, thoughtful noises every night. The only thing I could do to help her was to prepare herbal tea to soothe her nerves. I never interfered with her work as a coach. Emma knew that Isabella was Mr. Smith's daughter, but she didn't give her any special treatment. So, today, when I opened the lunch, I felt a surge of happiness. Today's lunch contained only pork cutlet. This morning, as Emma handed me the lunches, she said, "Sometimes, a simple lunch like this is nice, don't you think?" Even though she had to appear impartial on the surface, this was her way of quietly showing support, and I felt the same way. My phone, sitting on the desk, buzzed. It was a message from Mr. Smith. "It's the end of the month, but are you on an outside call today, Alex?" I quickly replied, "I'm working in the office today." A concise response came back almost immediately. "I'll be there soon." I glanced up at the clock on the sales floor wall. It was just past 2 p.m. All the sales department employees had already finished their lunch. I stood up to fetch the 2 lunches resting in the nearly empty refrigerator in the break room. That's strange. The break room in the sales department is small. My confused voice echoed, lingering before fading away. Opening the refrigerator, it was just as I had imagined, nearly empty. There were only a few condiments that had been sitting there since last year, belonging to no one in particular. I always placed the lunches on the top shelf, towards the back. I was sure I had put them there this morning. But now, they were gone. I searched the refrigerator thoroughly. There wasn't much else to search in the small break room, which only had a refrigerator, a microwave, and a small sink with an induction cooktop. The cabinet under the sink was locked, and the trash can was placed elsewhere to prevent smells from filling the room and to reduce the cleaner's workload. I checked inside the microwave and put my hands on the sink. I closed my eyes to recall my actions from this morning. I needed to hurry, otherwise, Mr. Smith would come to the break room. Just then, sweat began to bead on my forehead. "What are you looking for?" A cold voice was heard. Startled, I jumped and spun around. Parker was leaning against the break room door, watching me with a detached expression. Parker approached me with a nasty smile. "The lunchboxes I put in the refrigerator are..." "Oh, those," he said, his face briefly contorting before regaining his smirk. "I threw them out," but then immediately corrected with a smile and said, "What did you just say? Didn't you hear me? I said I threw them out because they were giving off a foul odor. It takes some nerve to serve Mr. Smith something that stinks like that." Parker placed a hand on my shoulder. "I'm saying I took care of those lunches filled with a regular employee's pathetic attempts to curry favor." Sweat beaded on Parker's forehead, and a forced smile made his cheeks twitch. His hand, resting on my shoulder, was trembling. "Why? Don't make me repeat myself. I'm doing this to correct someone like you who's trying to get ahead through such deceitful means." "That's not true, Parker. You don't really want to do this, do you?" The Parker who taught me about work and society isn't like this. I wondered how much courage it had taken for Parker to throw the lunches away. He was someone who always looked straight ahead with unwavering determination. His eyes were free from cunning or deceit. I took out the smartphone that had been vibrating in my pocket. I received a message from Mr. Smith. "I'm at the break room. Is there some sort of trouble?" If Parker had indeed thrown the lunches into the trash, there would be no hiding it. I sighed and muttered, "You're finished." "What?" Parker responded weakly. It was at that moment when I felt the pressure of Parker's hand on my shoulder. The door to the break room opened. "Oh, it was you, Parker." Sensing the tension between us, he quickly closed the door behind him. The three of us stood in the small room, a heavy silence hanging in the air. I decided to break it. "I apologize," I said to Mr. Smith. I nodded deeply, looking intently at my own knees. "The lunches." I glanced at Parker, who avoided my gaze, looking embarrassed. "The lunches, I forgot them at home." "What? But this morning, you were about to take them out of your backpack. And just now, you replied that it was fine to meet in the break room." I realized it after I got to my desk. I thought I might be able to retrieve them by lunchtime, but it proved difficult. "I'm sorry for wasting your time. So, if we go to your house now, the lunches will be there." It was unusual for Mr. Smith to speak in such a testing tone, and he asked me that question. Unable to say anything, I bit my lip and shook my head. Mr. Smith glanced at Parker and then let out a small sigh. He slowly extending his hand. Mr. Smith's hand did not reach my shoulder, but rather settled on Parker's trembling arm. "Since you're a parent, you should understand," Mr. Smith began, looking intently at Parker. Mr. Smith always made it a point to look directly into the eyes of the person he was addressing when expressing gratitude, apologies, or discussing important matters. On a crucial day when the starting lineup is decided, does my daughter have to face practice without dinner? Daughter. One of the two lunches was for Isabella. My portion was just an extra. "You know Isabella is working hard in basketball, right?" Parker nodded slightly at the CEO's words. "Mrs. Crawford is the coach of the basketball team Isabella is on. That's why I asked Alex to provide Isabella with nutritious meals." Parker crumpled to the floor. He placed his hands on the break room floor and muttered in a small voice that could be heard from this close distance, "I thought Alex might be trying to get closer by pushing his wife's cooking on me or bringing up prosthetics. It was my mistake to have the meals exchanged at the company. I caused unnecessary misunderstandings." But Mr. Smith crouched down to make eye contact with Parker. I quickly dropped to my knees on the floor as well. For the first time in a while, I noticed that Parker's face had gained small wrinkles. His hair, which used to be neatly groomed, was now left unkempt and mixed with gray. "Parker, you should know better than anyone that Alex isn't the kind of person who would do that." Mr. Smith's stern voice, which I had never heard before, seemed to reach Parker clearly. Tears were welling up in Parker's eyes. As the tears flowed down Parker's cheeks, It seemed like they were carrying away the burdens he had endured so far. It felt as though the self-deprecating feelings that had been in Parker's eyes just moments ago were flowing away with them. "Parker." I stood up and extended my hand to him. "Please let me leave early today. I can't involve Isabella in this matter. I'll go pick her up myself. So would it be all right if you had dinner at my place before practice? I'll take you to practice as well, of course. Is there still some food left?" "Probably. I always make extra." "Could I get the location of Isabella's school?" "Sure, I'll give you the address. Can you come by my office once?" Mr. Smith helped Parker rise, who was still looking at my hand. "As a department head, do you have any work instructions?" At Mr. Smith's words, Parker shook his head slightly. Just as I opened the door and Mr. Smith was about to leave the break room, he turned back, placed his hand on the sink, and addressed the still dazed Parker. "Parker." "Yes. Show that kind of courage in your work." Mr. Smith smiled and waved to Parker. Mr. Smith's driving was so smooth it was almost sleep-inducing. The turns were so gentle that it made me question whether we were actually turning. Right after we left the break room, Mr. Smith pulled my hand and said, "You don't need to leave early." He went to the sales department floor and, saying, "Alex is heading home directly today," grabbed my backpack with his free hand. He wrote NR next to my name on the white board in the sales department and then pulled me along again. While I was still in a daze, Mr. Smith's car had already started moving. When we stopped at a red light, Mr. Smith said with a gentle smile, "I appreciate your offer, but if an unfamiliar man suddenly shows up to pick up Isabella, she might get confused." Parker seemed to change color as soon as he heard Isabella's name. Yeah, Parker had always been very fond of Isabella. He used to play with her many times until she started elementary school. If I had explained from the start, there wouldn't have been such a misunderstanding. When I said this in a voice so soft it blended with the engine noise, Mr. Smith reassured me, saying, "It's not something for you to worry about." When we found out that Isabella's legs wouldn't move anymore, Parker was the first to come visit her. Even though he had children of his own, he cried more than I did. I couldn't help but widen my eyes in surprise. Seeing my astonished expression, Mr. Smith laughed out loud. "Is it that surprising? I was repeatedly told about the prosthetics, so I thought maybe there was some ill will. There should be understanding. After all, he works at our company. He's just narrow-minded right now." The car was making beeping noises. Before I knew it, we had arrived at some parking lot. I heard the sound of the parking brake being set. After taking a breath, Mr. Smith looked into the distance and said, "Everyone goes through such times." It was clear that Mr. Smith must have also been fond of Parker, who had come to visit and cried for Isabella. Parker's change has likely been the hardest on Mr. Smith. Isabella's school was located in a nature-rich area, even within New York. While Mr. Smith went to the staff room to pick up Isabella, I stayed in the car. I gazed at the distant buildings. I wondered what Parker, who was somewhere amidst the hustle and bustle, might be thinking now. "I need to talk to him tomorrow," I murmured and closed my eyes. Behind my eyelids, I saw Parker's sparkling face, the one that had said, "I won't give up on my career." Even though the game hadn't started yet, names of the players were already being called out in the venue. Today's basketball tournament was for athletes with prosthetics, and it was the first match. Emma, as a coach, was giving instructions to the players near the court. Next to me in the stands was Mr. Smith, who was watching the court while wearing a towel around his neck. "Isabella, do your best." Even though Mr. Smith usually dressed in a suit with a gentlemanly demeanor at work, he was sweating in a t-shirt for his daughter. Holding a handmade megaphone, he was shouting Isabella's name loudly. Yes, Isabella had successfully earned a starting position. Just like Mr. Smith, who never gives up on even the toughest business negotiations, his daughter is impressive. As I handed over a sports drink, Mr. Smith widened his eyes and then smiled awkwardly. "She's so determined for a girl. It worries me sometimes." Opening the cap of the bottle, Mr. Smith returned his gaze to the court. Sure enough, there were some kids who were jealous, saying it's because she's close with the coach. That's not true. Isabella wouldn't do that, and Emma, my wife, wouldn't select team members for an important match that way either. Yeah, but when someone is really invested, if they don't perform as expected, they might want to blame others. The sad expression on Mr. Smith's face made me wonder whom he was thinking of. He might be thinking of Parker's back, just like I was. I hope that's the case. Did Isabella have a falling out with that friend of hers? I took a sip from my own bottle and waited for Mr. Smith's response. Mr. Smith immediately smiled and shook his head. No way. Actually, I ended up feeling more frustrated. When I tried to talk to that kid's parents, Isabella stopped me. Isabella did. Yeah, she said. I'll silence them with my skills, so don't do anything rash. If I can do that, I'm prepared to withdraw from the starting lineup myself. Isn't that bold? Mr. Smith chuckled with his shoulders shaking, and with a dazzling smile, said, She's grown into a strong daughter. From the court, a sense of quiet spread throughout the venue. Our gazes naturally turned to the court. I spotted Emma watching the players near the court. The game was about to start. The light reflected off Emma's prosthetic arm,